So our organization is comprised of people who have a high level of unity. You have to agree with the points. And it's kind of one part think tank, that we're a place where we can come together and talk about what our visions are, what our strategy are, because we all are in different social movements, and part of a strategic, war room, if you would say. Like, where are we going to put our efforts? What work should our members do in what area? And if you want to talk a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and part of that process is understanding how the analysis and the vision and the strategy that we have can become part of the movements that we're already involved in. Because we believe that we need to build popular movements in all the different spheres. But we also want those movements not to be isolated from each other and not linked only by members of a revolutionary organization, but linked by vision. We want people to, within these movements, to understand that that struggle is necessarily part of a larger one, and that that's really the only way that you're going to carry and create a truly popular revolutionary movement in our country.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that. So that's the presentation. Now we can open up to discussions, and also tell people, feel free to speak your minds. I've heard worse than anything you would probably say to me.
You talk about the 4 different spheres, and I heard you say that you have to completely understand each sphere to know how interconnected they are, and in the context of ecological and international issues.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if it's possible to completely understand each sphere, because everything is so interconnected that the more we learn about anything, it opens up more questions and more room for there to be ignorance about certain topics. So, did that make sense?
Yeah, no,
okay.
I think so. We'll make an attempt with that. Well, first of all, the idea of understanding this way isn't be like, okay, there's this sphere, it's a way to kind of abstract it, so then we can analyze it and then kind of bring it back down. So we kind of argued that a lot of oppressive institutions in society have their origins in more or less one sphere. But because the way our society has evolved, it doesn't necessarily have to be this way, but we'd argue that most of the world, and at least especially the United States, that each sphere has influenced the other and has shaped, actually not just influenced, but has shaped it. I mentioned it briefly, but there's nothing about economics that says that women have to do work that is the more nurturing and the caregiving. There's nothing about economics that says that. But we can see, example, like in a restaurant, that there's a sexual division of labor that is influenced by patriarchal norms that say that this is like women's work, these are the values, and this is what like women do, and then it's transferred into work. So like in a restaurant, who are the hosts and hostesses? It's women and gay men. And then I've run a restaurant 11 years, that's who it is. Or it's a maitre d'.
I laughed because
yeah, no, it's true.
I've seen that a lot. I've worked a lot of it.
And or see, that's just one example. So that's the sexual, or like the nursing. Nursing is largely women. There's also, we can see that there's almost like a racialized division of labor in that as well, where now it's a lot of immigrant women of color. So it originates in one, but they obviously have intertwined. So we're saying that you can't understand one if you don't understand the rest of them, because they're so interconnected and shaped. As far as, we'll never know everything, but we can have a kind of, we look at these institutions, what about gender roles? We look at, right now we have mothering and fathering in a lot of ways, and you can see they have kind of separate roles. What if we mixed that, we had parenting? Would that, like, I have 3 nieces and nephews who learned gender identity in roles at like such an early age. Like, no, that's daddy's job, that's mommy's job, and it's through things that aren't even their fault at all, but it's on TV. The fact that my brother-in-law makes more money and can make more money, so my sister's college educated, but she's a stay-at-home mom because it makes more sense. So like various things like that. But we can never fully understand, of course. Like, we think this is now part of our theory is that it can, if we find new evidence that there's different things, we'll be opened up. But it's always evolving. We're finding more now. Queer theory is evolving. Even new stuff about input. I say we still don't fully understand environmental economics. That's something that, like, what's a threshold level? But even if we understand cost of oil, like we shouldn't do things, at one point when we're planning our economy, we have to know what's the threshold of certain resource depletion that we, there's certain things that we still don't understand that's years away, but if we have the framework, we'll be able to adapt to it when we get to it.
That's really good to hear you say. I like hearing the word adapt with that. So I just wanted to make sure, because I get concerned when people say they want to completely understand something, because that means that, like, that implies that we can completely understand things, when really everything's adapting and changing and evolving. So.
It's more like we recognize that private ownership leads to inequality and towards authoritarian relationships, so we want to eliminate that with someone else. That's kind of like the understanding, but if something else comes along and we realize, like back in the day, Marxists and socialists used to believe that class relations only came from just owners and workers. We argue there's a class in between owners and workers called the coordinator class, which derives not from ownership, but from a monopoly of skills and empowering work and decision making. The 20 to 25%, the managers, the professionals. And that's only a relatively new thing that's coming in economic theory, so, which is actually informed by a lot of the interpersonal stuff that came out of the feminist movement.
Thanks.
Well, you take that.
Yeah, so you guys are talking about possibly raising wages for people in the back house, or distributing the racial segregation of work or whatever. I was just wondering, like, how would that happen?
Okay. I guess I talked about this. All right. The reason why people in the back of the house, for example, in New York City, make less money and are mostly Mexican and Latino immigrants is, one, they've been forced off their land in Mexico through free trade agreements and global capitalism. And they come here with lower bargaining power because they might have less English skills, and it's just more accepted that that's where you go if you're Mexican. You go to the back of the house. That's kind of what you do. And then also the people who own the restaurants want a facade and an image of young white men and women. And there's an age thing to the restaurants too, where you're seeing less and less, unless you have a union, find an older server in a fancy restaurant. It doesn't really happen anymore. So what you do is, when you're organizing, there's nothing in these contracts or fighting for things that say you can't demand certain things. It's whether you have the power to win the demand. It's just the fact is that labor movement doesn't have the power to win anything right now, usually the way it fights. So if we had a strong enough solidarity within the workplace, and the labor movement eventually has to be community-based as well, because the way that capital is so fluid and it can cross borders, that we need support on all ends, is that we would say, okay, we recognize they have language barriers. We want either the union would run a, like, say, an ESL program on its own, or they try to get funding from the workplace to do so. And once they hit a certain threshold that they're capable to go to the front of the house, we want more opportunities for them to go to the front of the house. And at the same time, once we hit that threshold, we want to be able to have a mix of jobs where waiters don't only just serve and take orders, but we no longer have that. We have people who work at the restaurant, and then we have to share the division of labor. That, of course, is, and we could do that within capitalism. That's all thing. We don't have to wait for the revolution to do that. It's whether we're strong enough to implement it, and whether we have the vision you can think about in the first place.
Sounds like you may have considered a similar idea, but I've recently casted, I guess, a vision, to use your same terms, of creating a free kitchen space where anybody can come in and use the space as a kitchen. They would have staples, like staples there already, and people were showing them how to cook just in the middle of an urban environment. Do you maybe have any suggestions on how to do the backcasting for that, to kind of form the strategies, or have you seen a similar idea happen in the urban environment somewhere else, maybe in the Northeast?
Well, there's one thing to, before people leave, you have to leave whatever. We have lots of lit up here if you want to come and take some before you leave.
Yeah, and leave your name if you want to get emails from us and stuff, and more information about what we're doing. There's a sign-up list there as well. So we're talking about a collective kitchen space or a free kitchen space in an urban environment, and what steps you might have to take to create an alternative institution like that. I mean, I think I haven't seen anything specifically like that in Rochester, which is where most of my organizing around that would be. But I think that crucial to the process of creating an institution like that would be coordinating with the populations wherever that space is going to be, right? So there's a tendency I've found, particularly in creating alternative institutions on the left, to for the communities who have the possibility and the means to create those alternative institutions, to make them for themselves. And a lot of the time that ignores the fact that the people who need the alternative institutions today, the reason that we're creating them, are the folks that don't have the means to create them for themselves. And I think that a crucial aspect, and one that would prove to be beneficial in terms of the longevity of an institution like that, would be to become seriously involved in the community where you're creating the institution, and the people who would stand to benefit the most and the most dramatically from an institution like that. So I think programs are working with folks in the community who understand the need for a communal space because of the nature of the oppression that they're facing in that community. And using that in coordination with folks from the student community or from the radical community who have the idea already, and saying, well, what do you folks need most? What is most crucial to you in terms of what should we stock this place with? You know, what do you want to learn most from a community kitchen? Do you want us to give these kind of skill shares or these kind of skill shares? What will prove the most beneficial to your community? Because ultimately, that's what's going to engender a deep institutionalization of that particular project. Is if people really take value in it and then want to start working with it. And that's, of course, the process through which these alternative institutions can become truly revolutionary actors. Is if you're addressing the actual needs of the populace, and you're guising it in terms of this is part of a larger movement. The reason we're doing this is not just because we think people need to eat and they need a free kitchen, but also because we need those folks to eat so that we can build a movement. And this is part of a structural issue within the society we live in that we need to address. And so I think that's a crucial part of the process.
I want to say one point on alternative institutions in general that you kind of touched on. Say we have one, I'm very impressed with like the whole Northwest so far. I was in Portland, this is kind of a funny story, and I stayed at one kid's house. He's like, oh, so we had to talk at the Variant in Portland, which is like this media collective space. And like, oh, so how many like political collective spaces do you have in New York City? I'm like, a city of 8 million people. I'm like, 4. Like there really is probably less than 10. I can't even think of more than 5. And it's because of stuff like rent and something. So I'm kind of impressed by the stuff you have. But and I don't know how it is out here, so I'm not saying part of just but in general. Alternative institutions always say we have a co-op and we have a free kitchen. Then we have to, like the vision of this is part of a larger movement. We have to start to work together. And imagine if we had blocks where no longer do we have to rely on going to Walmart, or no longer we can rely on going to movement and institutions of our own that provide services. But of course, within a market economy, we're going to get crushed unless we eventually maybe take over some of those businesses and buy the workers and kick out the bosses. But we got to do them at the same time. But when we are building the alternative institutions, remember that to build up and network them, and we can actually colonize, in a sense, parts of the system before we actually kick it out.